Welcome to Addicted to Watches. The watch we have here is not the same watch it was when I purchased it. It started its life as a humble Seiko 5, but I have since modded it to create a new watch. Today, it's like we'll be reviewing two watches. We'll talk a little about the original, but I'd prefer to show you more of what I've made it into. This was the Seiko SNK357. Have you ever had a watch and thought it was good, but could be great with some slight changes? Or have you ever just wanted to take apart your watch? If so, then you should buy an automatic Seiko. The Seiko modding community is huge, and has the SKX 007 and 009 to thank for it. That popular and now discontinued diver spawned many companies specifically making bezels, dials, crystals, hands, and much more, just for Seiko watches. The other thing that helped this community grow was consistency from Seiko. They used a 28.5mm dial size on many of their watches, as well as ensuring the hand size for the range of their movements was the same. This let modders use aftermarket dials and hands in more than just the SKX, as I have in this SNK model. A great thing about using a Seiko 5 as a modding base is the price. I was able to buy this watch for just $95. The sheer variety of aftermarket parts available is staggering. Everything from loomed crowns and display casebacks to chapter rings, dials, and hands. Is there a design or color you like? Odds are there is a Seiko part to make it. Many parts stores also offer dials and hands to turn your Seiko into a homage of a much more expensive watch. I did that here, though maybe in a less obvious way than others choose to. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's look at how this watch started its life. This watch was originally sold as a Seiko SNK357, one of Seiko's budget entry-level automatic watches. I chose this watch to use as a base for my mod because I really liked the shape of the case and the size. It also happened to come with a fantastic dial that almost looked out of place on such a cheap watch. The sunburst blue from this watch can look plain from a distance, but when you get close, you can see that it is actually very complicated. All across the dial, we can see the Seiko 5 logo textured in minute detail. Though in most lights, it flies under the radar, when the light hits it right, it really comes to life. In my opinion, Seiko does some of the best dials at all of their price ranges, and the SNK357 exemplifies that. Fairly simple baton hands match the indices of the dial, and as expected from a watch of this style, the loom was nothing spectacular. But that's all in the past, so let's take a look at the watch now. It should be no surprise that I really like textured dials. We've seen that on quite a few of the watches on this channel already. Seeing this dial while browsing was what inspired the whole build in the first place. The pattern on the dial is a Seigaiha pattern, which is a traditional Japanese pattern that literally translates to blue sea and waves, and you can clearly see where the name comes from. The concentric circles that form this pattern interlock and overlap to recreate the look of waves on the surface of the ocean. It is a pattern that has been used in art, architecture, fashion, pottery, and more. You might notice that there are some waves without the inner concentric circles. That makes this specific pattern a Yabure Seigaiha pattern, with Yabure translating to broken. This wave pattern is broken up by the empty waves. You'll notice that this dial has Seiko branding on it. This, however, is not a dial made by Seiko, but rather an aftermarket part that uses the branding. Unfortunately, this is a common occurrence for dials on AliExpress, where I bought this part. Numerous other dial makers use their own branding or other placeholder logos in this space. It just depends on how you feel about a dial with a brand name not made by that brand. For me, in this case, I'm not too bothered as it's still a Seiko watch, and I'm not trying to pass it off as an original Seiko model, but rather one I modded. You can ignore the limited edition printed below the pinion, as well as the 300 meters of water resistance. I did, however, decide to match that little pop of red on the dial with an arrow second hand with a red tip. The hour and minute hands are fairly simple fence post hands, with the hour hand being split horizontally in half. One thing you might notice is that there are no minute markers. I will admit that I didn't actually notice this until I'd put the watch back together. For a dial like this going into a diver's watch, the chapter ring would take care of that, but as this case does not have one, it can make reading or setting the time take a second longer than usual, but I've gotten used to it now. Looking around the case, there is a nice mixture of brushed and polished surfaces. The top surface of the lugs, where it meets the bracelet, is brushed and contrasts nicely with the polished bezel surrounding the dial. From the side, we can see the polished surfaces as well as the gentle curve of the case, helping it to hug the wrist when worn. Coming in at a case size of 38mm and a height of just 10mm, it's suitable for small and medium-sized wrists. I personally think that 38 to 39mm is a great size for my wrist. A small, slightly recessed crown sits at the 4 o'clock position, as is common with most Seiko 5 watches. The crown is polished, but unsigned, which is what you'd expect at this price point. A screw-down display caseback unfortunately only provides a water-resistant rating, but does offer a look at the 7S26 day-date movement powering the watch. Being an entry-level Seiko automatic, the 7S26 movement does not hack or hand-wind, and beats at that familiar 3 Hz. This crystal is just hardlex, as is the one on the front of the watch covering the dial. You don't get any anti-reflective coating from this entry-level piece either. Seiko 5 bracelets are notorious for being cheap, nasty hair nippers. While I still have all the hair on my wrist, the bracelet is pretty cheap and nasty. From a distance, it looks quite nice, with what seems to be a 7-piece link, mixing brushed and polished surfaces. However, looking from underneath, we can see that it is actually a 5-piece link. Better than 3, I suppose. From this angle, you can also see that each link is folded rather than solid steel. Another cost-cutting mark of the Seiko 5 range. Overall, when on wrist, the bracelet does not feel too bad, but does not reflect the same quality of construction as the case. Swapping it out for a nice leather strap would go a long way to improving this watch. Having a fairly commonly sized lug width of 18mm will make that fairly easy to do. I mentioned that I modded this watch as a homage. Have you picked which one it is of? If you said Tudor Black Bay 36, then you'd be right. Of course, everyone has a different definition of homage, but when making this, I did not want to make an exact copy. I wanted to take the things I liked about the Tudor and make it my own. What I like about the Black Bay is the diver's style dial and hands used in a more standard everyday case. Great lume and legibility without the chunky case or rotating bezel. So I got my parts and modded my watch. The modding process itself was not too difficult with the right tools, those mainly being a caseback opener, a pair of fine tweezers, and a hand remover, all of which can be bought very cheaply from eBay. After removing the caseback, there is a small button that, when depressed, allows the crown to be removed. Once removed, the movement, dial, and hands come out of the case all together. Then, it is just a matter of removing the hands and dial carefully and replacing them with the new parts, being careful not to scratch or bend the hands, as well as make sure they are seated properly on the pinion. After that, just put everything back in the case, insert the crown, and screw on the case back. Having talked about the watch long enough, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. Like I said, I feel that a 38 to 39mm case size is perfect for my wrist for this style of everyday watch. It's big enough to be easily legible at a glance, without being too big or getting in the way. The taper as the bracelet leaves the case also helps make it wear very comfortably. Unfortunately, I don't have any 18mm straps with me right now to show you how it looks on those. For the longest time, I'd thought about modding a Seiko, but always put it off to another time. My experience with this simple mod, changing out the dial and hands, was fun and rewarding. It helps me to understand a bit better what goes into a mechanical movement, and the end result is a one-of-a-kind watch that I created. It also gives me an appreciation of the scale at which watchmakers have to work with parts much smaller than the hands that I used. If you've ever considered modding a watch, I'd say go for it. There are plenty of tutorials here on YouTube and other places on the internet to help you through the process. At the end, you'll be able to say you have a watch that is truly yours. What do you think about this watch? Have you modded your own watch before? Would you have chosen to use different parts? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.